So we can start talking about things generally of why be bigger. So eukaryotic cells are bigger than prokaryotic cells are bigger than viruses. What are the advantages of being bigger? Also, what are the disadvantages? Before you start talking about how things become larger, it's helpful to ponder why they become larger. So what are the benefits? So one of the benefits is that if you have big things that are engulfing other cells, like those phagocytic protists, if you're bigger, the protist may not be able to engulf you. So if you can come up with a mat of cells that's quite large, you might be able to be resistant to engulfing protists, for example. You also gain an ability to engulf or ingest things. So the protists can engulf other cells in part because they're bigger than those other cells. Or the animals can ingest things, they can take things into their bodies in part because they're bigger than the things that they're taking into their bodies. You also can have greater sophistication, which can allow you to invade different niches. We'll get to what a niche is when we get to ecology, but different ways of doing things beyond just how you acquire your nutrients. You can have cellular differentiation if you're bigger, which means that you can have different cells that are responsible for doing different things. Within the same organism, you can have different cells that are specialized for doing one thing versus another, which may allow that organism to do those individual tasks with a greater ability, greater success. And one of the most basic of the cellular differentiations is between somatic cells and germline cells. The somatic cells are responsible for keeping the organism alive and acquiring nutrients. The germline cells are specialized cells just for reproducing. And you can get away with that if you have more than one cell. You might be able to have greater competitiveness. A good example of that is the shading of plants. The trees, in their way, are more competitive than the organisms that live below them because they have greater access to light. You also see this in sponges. Big sponges, in a sense, shade out smaller sponges that are downstream from them because they're able to acquire all the food particles before the sponges behind them are able to acquire those particles. You might have access to physically separated resources. Again, the plants need light and they also need water and minerals. They get the minerals and water in the roots, and they get the light from the light is acquired at the leaves. And so there can be a gap between those two places, and you're not going to have that gap unless you're big. They may not need that gap if there's nothing to shade them, but if they're going to be competitive, no, I'm still there. If you're going to be competitive, in many cases, you need to separate things out. There are certain kinds of bacteria, for example, that require two different nutrients that are found in two different places that are close but not identical. And they actually are able to exist in both locations, in some cases by migrating back and forth within these sheaths from one location to another. So they can acquire one nutrient and then acquire the other nutrient, then acquire the other nutrient, then acquire the other nutrient. You can't do that unless you're big enough to do that. You might have more progeny production per reproductive episode. Why do plants go through this insanity of having alternation of generations? Part of the answer to that is that the bigger they can make the sporophyte, then the more progeny they can produce per fertilization. And if you are living on land, your fertilizations may be rather dear, particularly with the more primitive plants where the fertilizations occur with flagellated sperm and eggs that are not flagellated eggs, but sperm and eggs, where you actually have to have water in order for the sperm to find the eggs. I mean, the water isn't around all the time, in part because these organisms are living on land and they're no longer algae living in the water. And so fertilizations are dear, and if you want to maximize the number of spores you produce per fertilization, then you want to make a very big sporophyte, the product of that fertilization, so that you can make lots of spores. And if you look at a fern basically are these big leaves, and they have these leaves and they produce huge numbers of spores per leaf. They have these sori, which are bundles of sporangia, which are spore-producing organs. And that compares with the moss. The moss just produces a little tiny plant that produces this little capsule that makes these spores, one capsule per fertilization, whereas a fern can be huge and produce many, many more times spores to disseminate their kind elsewhere. So you can get more progeny, in this case it would be spores, per reproductive episode. So in this case, that would be per fertilization. You also can have iterable parity, which is another way of saying that you can have a reproductive episode that's followed in the future by a reproductive episode that's followed in the future by a reproductive episode. Think of an oak tree producing acorns every year. If you're not big, you can't do that. If you're a bacterium, typically you will go through a division, and that will be your reproductive episode. But if you're a tree, or if you're a human, you can produce progeny in different years, or in different seasons, or what have you. And some of those times when you're producing the progeny might be good times, some might be bad times. So you're increasing the likelihood that you're going to be producing progeny when times are good, and therefore the progeny have some potential to survive. Iterable parity, but you're not going to see that if you're a small, simple organism. But then what are the costs? So those are the upsides to being bigger. What are the costs of being bigger? One of the problems is that you have smaller populations. So populations can be more stable, more diverse, better able to resist extinction if they're huge rather than tiny. But when you're bigger, one of the things that happens is that you can only fit so many individuals per unit volume or unit area, and you'll be able to fit fewer and fewer individuals as your actual body size becomes larger. You have greater maintenance and growth costs. There's a huge number of small organisms that are alive in this world today, but there are also all these sophisticated ones. So why are the small, less sophisticated ones still there when we've got all these big, glorious, sophisticated ones? The answer is that while the small ones may not be able to do what they do necessarily as good as the bigger, more sophisticated ones, they also don't have to acquire as many resources in order to reproduce because they're small, they're simple. It's not costly to build themselves or to maintain themselves or even to reproduce. So they can make tons of progeny. And as long as they're living in an environment that they can get away with acquiring resources and making their progeny, they're doing fine. It's the invasion of new environments where they require greater sophistication or size that these smaller things can't get away with what they do. But they have this great advantage that they can put more resources into reproduction. They also can have smaller surface to volume ratios. So they don't have to worry about coming up with sophisticated means of making sure that their larger sizes are fed or that their larger sizes receive enough oxygen because they can just rely on diffusion across membranes in order to acquire things. So again, they don't need to be sophisticated or more sophisticated if they're smaller. They can have more sophisticated reproductive strategies such as meiosis, but also something like internal fertilization. I mean, that's not something you're going to see among bacteria, for example. Once bodies get big, never mind individual cells, once bodies get big, you've got the problem of how do you move stuff around the bodies. Simpler small animals and also simpler small plants like the mosses rely simply on diffusion to move stuff around. But if you're going to become bigger, you've got to get better than just moving things around by diffusion. You have to have vasculature, you have to have hearts, you have to have sophisticated means of moving stuff from one place to another. If you're bigger, you also have greater susceptibility to shear forces. So high winds break things apart, in part because things are not resistant to having one end of the thing be ripped this way and the other ripped that way. It tends to rip things apart. That's shear forces. And as you get bigger, if you're in the water or if you're on land with winds or what have you, if you're just moving about, if one part of your body moves this way, another part of your body moves that way, you have to have a resistance to ripping. That's just a problem with being larger. And so you end up being more susceptible to shear forces, so you have to have ways of dealing with that. You have to have connective tissue or woody tissue or what have you that keeps things from falling apart like that or ripping apart like that. When you're big, you're a sitting duck for parasites. And to avoid that, you have to have a sophisticated means of preventing infection by parasites or infestation by parasites. So you need to have sophisticated immune systems, more sophisticated than you would see, say, in a unicellular organism. And similar to this problem with sophisticated immune systems, there's this huge problem of cheating that occurs among multicellular organisms especially. And that could either be these parasites that come in from the outside and basically start taking your resources from you, or they can be cells that mutate and as a consequence start taking more resources than they ought to. And an example of the latter would be the formation of cancer cells. And in order to be sophisticated and big, you've got to have ways of both preventing parasites from attacking you, but also preventing your own cells from going rogue on you and causing damage.